I'm slightly sick of going to places where someone's standing on stage and telling me about the benefits of X
Sleep,
and Y, and we know. I know that. What about the person in front of you? How are you going to get them to do any of that? When they haven't even got a bed, how can they improve their sleep? That's what it's about, and it's more about sort of maximizing things with the greatest ease. Like the Bill Gates lazy guy thing. That's me. He gives the most complex tasks to his laziest employee because he'll find the most elegant way of sorting it out. And that's how I kind of operate, probably because I'm a reluctant entrant into medicine in the first place. And now that I'm in it and I've kind of been doing it for a while, I think I sort of see what's coming and what we need to kind of do. And I'll try and do that with my patients as much as I can.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle.
I just love sharing your knowledge with as many people as possible, because you've definitely inspired me in a massive way, probably more than you know. And I know you're a very humble person, so this is probably cringing. You're probably cringing as you hear this, but it's really important for me to remind you of just how impactful you've been in my career. And how our conversations are as well, because that really does shape the kind of content that I put out there, and I love your projects and everything else. So before we get into it, let's no, of course, mate. Talk to me about your year, because you've had a tough year. You've been really authentic on social media. You've really sort of been pretty transparent with everything you've gone through. So for those who don't know, tell us about what's been going on.
Yeah, it has been a difficult year, and I think the last time you and I could have met up was at Knitting Sawney, wasn't it? Which I think you went with your crew, and I was with mine. We didn't sort of meet up because it's an amazing night, wasn't it? But
amazing.
And the reason he pops into my head is that my dad passed away in the summer of this year after a kind of. It was really odd, actually. He went in for a knee replacement that he'd been putting off for about 10 years, and finally thought, you know what, I'm going to go and get it done. And then had it done and just wasn't recovering after he came out of hospital. And then we didn't know what was going on. He was really confused, losing weight. And it turned out in the end that he had a sort of something called a T-cell lymphoma, this sort of cancer of the lymphatic system that hadn't been diagnosed because they're really difficult to diagnose. It wasn't like it was anyone's fault, and then died about 6 weeks later. And the reason Knitting Sawney pops into my mind is when we were thinking about the aftermath and the funeral, I was trying to pick some music. So the funeral wasn't a religious one particularly. There were sort of elements of spirituality in there. But I picked a song called Bengali Song by Knitting Sawney, which really resonates with me. It's off one of his very early albums called, I forget the name now, God, how embarrassing. I think it's called Disciples, something about the priest. Anyway, Displacing the Priest, I think it's called. But and that was an album before I even knew about him. But it really sort of gets me there, because it sums up, for me, a lot of my dad's kind of early life. And so that kind of loss, that you hear about people passing away all the time, and we see it in our work, don't we? But until it sort of happens to you, it's definitely the closest relative I've lost, and the sense of loss is enormous. Nothing really prepares you for it. And what I would say for anyone who has lost a parent, it's almost like, losing your parents is like the very last bit of growing up and becoming a proper adult, because it's a really odd thing. And no one, one of my very close friends has just lost his dad a few days ago, and he's going through what I did. And it's a really difficult time. Also, my parents lost their parents years ago, and I never really totally understood why it was that my mum would still to this day get sad about her parents dying. I'm like, Mum, that was like 35 years ago, But the point is that loss, that sort of sense of grief never really leaves you. You live with it, and it stays with you. And as what you were saying about social media, what I try and do on my podcast is talk about really sort of what makes us human. It's called Saving Lives in Slow Motion, and what does that even mean? Well, it's kind of what I think GPs should be doing or do in our working life. And it covers areas that relate to everyone, but are not kind of strictly medical. So grief is a very common one. I see lots of people who are grief stricken, and you don't just get over grief. That's the thing. If you've never been grief stricken, you don't really understand that it's something that's permanent. It's not sort of, oh, you're okay now, oh yeah, your dad died, but you're all right now, surely everything's back to, and the problem is the world just carries on, and doesn't wait for you. Do you know what I mean? So it has been tough. I mean, I've had to move my mum up near me, which is great because I see her sort of nearly every day. But that is not a small feat. She's moved out of a house that she's sort of lived in for the last 38 years, probably hasn't stayed a night alone for the last 38 years. Do you know what I mean? And that's a big adjustment. So lots of adjustments, lots of change, but yeah, learning to kind of adapt to it like we have to as all, creatures do to their sort of environment.
Yeah. I first of all, sorry. We've talked about it before, but when you told me, it kind of came out completely the blue, as I'm sure it did for you as well. And this is still very fresh for you, so I imagine you're still going through a lot of that process yourself. And like you just eloquently said there as well, you never really get over it. You're always going to have some element of grief or bereavement. But in terms of how you are coping, considering you are someone who's super experienced with breaking bad news as well as dealing with patients who are going through similar scenarios, have you found that some of the coping strategies that you've been talking to other people have been easier to put in place yourself, or is this something that you just we have sort of the instruction manual, but putting into practice those things that we tell other people is actually near impossible or a lot harder than we thought?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's and I think the reason why grief and bereavement is so unique, I now realize, is that there is just nothing else like it. It's on a totally separate level to anything else, and I say in my pod episode about it, people who lose a child, for example, I have no idea how they cope. I mean, I really don't, and I, have lost in admiration for anyone who can get on with their life after that. But you're quite right. I mean, a lot of our learning as doctors is through patients, isn't it, and what they sort of go through and what they tell you. And one of the things that really struck me after my dad's death is how many people you suddenly have these intense relationships with. So we had to get a celebrant to take the funeral. So they have a really special set of skills. They rock up at your house, they don't know you from Adam, and suddenly within 2 hours they've got a really good understanding of what your dad was like, what your mum's needs are, and what the family dynamic is. And so she was amazing, and she sort of came in, and it was me, my brother, and my mum sat around, and she was looking at my mum, she goes, yeah, your boys are definitely in charge, aren't they? And she could sort of spot that, the way that the three of us sort of, kind of roll, if you like. And that was amazing. And then suddenly you're in contact with a funeral director, and they have to have a really special set of skills. And I'm not demeaning anyone's sort of suffering, but they do that for their job every day. But like we do as doctors. But they were just super professional, and I think as doctors we're sort of hyper aware of how people communicate, and whether they're just ticking boxes, and there was none of that. They were really, really compassionate, and these are things that are essential services, like healthcare. They are, because all of us die, and all of us, if you can, actually nowadays not everyone does get a funeral because people often can't afford it, which is another issue in itself socially. But and the word essential kept sort of cropping up in my head, in that, essentialism, I suddenly started to think, do you know what, time's like my only commodity that really matters. You suddenly realize the value of it when someone passes away. And so, yeah, it's a blur, and your head is a bit of a mess. I think the first sort of few, days, weeks, I'm sure this will relate to anyone who's had a loss of that grief process. You, up until the funeral, I felt that Dad was sort of still with us, you know, even though he'd passed away, he was very much there. And then as soon as that's over, you get this weird feeling. It's a little bit like the feeling that you get after you get married, or a big sort of celebration, but with a totally different energy, and you just feel you don't know how to think. It's very empty. And so yeah, I'm still sort of, you know, I don't think you ever get back to how you were before it happened, you know, which is another coming to terms with thing. And I'm now much sort of more selective about things. So I don't rush to sort of email people back necessarily, because I think that can wait. It's not important. It's not essentialist. Do you know what I mean? And so it makes me, I don't want to sort of come across as, oh, he just sounds like he's just become more selfish. Maybe if that's the way you want to put it. But you've got to kind of look after yourself and kind of really think about what's important in your life. And if nothing else, that it does that in spades, because you're never going to bring that person back. You've just got to, you know, acknowledge that it's a terrible loss. So you know, and I'm lucky I got on well with my dad. You know, I know people often don't have that relationship, and it's much harder for them because they think, oh, I wish we'd made up, or I wish we'd sort of said certain things, and I got to do all that. So you know, yeah, I'm blessed in that sense.
That's a really interesting perspective, actually. You know, considering some people have broken relationships, and when they pass away, there is never the ability to, you know, make reparations and make amends. So actually having that close relationship is something that you cherish. You know, that I think that speaks to like the way you're processing things as well. And the other thing that I wanted to pick up on was how certain people have different ways in which they process grief. So I've got a colleague of mine whose mother passed away 2 years ago, and to this day, you know, we'll be chatting, and then she'll break into a crying session, which is totally fine from my perspective. I mean, like, you know, obviously we deal with this all the time, but for that person, they often feel quite guilty that, or embarrassed that they still are having this, you know, deep bereavement reaction, considering it's been 2 years. And to your point that you said earlier, sometimes it could be decades and you'll still have that visceral reaction to loss, because it is part of that human experience. And, you know, I'm really lucky in that I still have both my parents, and the closest relatives I've had that have passed away to me have been my grandparents. That happened quite a few years ago. And despite that, and despite seeing so many people, it's really hard to like really truly understand how you might be feeling in this moment. Do you know what I mean? It's a difficult one. Whenever I talk about grief to people, for example, I spoke to Mo Gowda on the podcast a few weeks back, and we were talking about his son, who unfortunately passed away from a routine operation. It was an appendectomy that went wrong. He was only 19, I believe, at the time, and so he had to process that whilst having depression himself. You know, having a more open conversation about grief and bereavement in general is something that we don't tend to do very well as British people. If I'm honest, like in different cultures, they have more of an appreciation for it. So I'm glad we're having these kind of conversations. But I always, on a personal level, I always struggle to really connect with how that might be feeling, how you might be feeling. I can only just try my best.
Yeah, and there's, you know, I totally understand that, because I would have been exactly the same, in that it is one of those things that nothing prepares you for it. It's just unique, honestly. And I'm not saying I've lived, you know, I've lived quite a sheltered life in some ways, but I'm kind of long enough in the tooth to have, and also seen so much in my career to kind of have quite a good understanding of other processes. But nothing is like this. It is like being hit by a train. Not that I've been hit by a train. I'm just using, you know, metaphorical language. But you're right. It's like a sort of visceral pain. I'll give you a really detailed sort of example of what it is. So sometimes what happens with grief, something will sort of trigger a thought about the person that you've lost. And I don't know whether this is what happened with your friend, but you might, you know, for example, walk into a shop and then see a chair that's exactly like her mum's chair or something. And that just triggers a bunch of memories and makes you feel, that it's that sort of thing. Or what would happen for me, a few weeks after my dad passed away, I'd wake up in the mornings and it would suddenly hit me that, oh God, I've just realized dad died. I know that, your logical brain knows that happened. And then you just feel terribly, uncontrollably sad, just, with this almost sort of, visceral pain that just, and then it sort of passes, and then the rest of the day's not so bad. But then it goes in waves, and it is a real sort of I kind of can't stand cliches, but my brain is so sort of that way wired in terms of the words I use and all that sort of. I should have gone into PR or comms or something, but it is literally like, it is waves, and the problem with waves is they sort of crash eventually, don't they? A real wave would, and that's exactly what it's like. You just sort of think, no, I'm doing all right, actually, I'm doing okay, and then suddenly it's like boom. But and there's not much else that's like that. It's sort of, I think the closest thing that, if you've not been through it, that I've been trying to think, what else have I had that's been like that, and it'll be something along the lines of, which is totally nowhere near as serious, of failing exams again and again or something at med school, going, oh, I'm never going to get through this, and then you sort of, but that's a different sort of loss and a different sort of, and it's not even remotely on a level to losing someone. But and now I realize how stupid that was. It just puts everything else into perspective. Another cliched sentence, but it really does.
Yeah, the way you just described the visceral nature of pain, and it's in our vernacular, it's how we describe things, and it's our brain processing loss in a very physical manner. And it reminds me of what myself and Deepak Ravindran were talking about a few weeks ago, actually, about pain, who I must connect you with. Actually, I think you both would really get on. And the way he described pain and our processing to us made sense on so many levels, because it made me appreciate what chronic pain is like for so many people, but also the physical manifestation of psychological pain as well. And it's something that I think I feel like I've led quite a sheltered life up to this point, because I haven't had that loss experience, and every feeling in me is like hoping I never come to that. But obviously it is just a part of adulthood, it is part of growing up, and it's something that we have to transition to, and getting comfortable with the knowledge that we're going to have to experience this kind of loss at some point in our life. It's something we need to get a lot more used to, I guess.
I think one of the things that's absolutely right, I mean, one of the things that's helped me is that and the sort of upsides, if you like, of grief and someone passing away, because there's a lot of there's some moments of joy as well, these funny things when you're talking about the person you've lost, or looking through old photos. There's a lot of humor that arises, that just, and suddenly you think, oh gosh, should I be laughing? It feels really wrong but that happens really quickly. And also the thing about the person you've lost is that they're sort of with you forever now. My dad's sort of constantly with me, to the point where I think a lot more about what he might be thinking or saying now that he's not around, because when someone is around, you take that for granted, and you think, oh God, Dad's ringing, I bet he's going to say, yeah, don't let the kids go out in the dark because it's been snowing, or something like that, whereas now, he'd be sat here thinking, oh God, Ruthie's mic's really big, isn't it, or whatever, just or like, oh no, he's another guy who doesn't shave like me, because he'd always sort of go, oh, you're going to just, do you never shave anymore? That sort of thing is quite nice, you know what I mean? And you can predict, and almost, I think I sort of think, sometimes I think, oh God, it's annoying actually, Dad would know the answer to this, but then you sort of think, what would he say? And then you can sort of almost answer it for yourself. There's a lot of that goes on as well. So it's not all, it is bad, there's no doubt about it, but it's not all terrible. There are some moments where you have to live with it. That's the reality of it. So,
definitely. I guess it's it's the way you frame things as well, and it's easy for me to say that as someone who hasn't experienced loss like that. But you're demonstrating to us that the way in which you can get. I mean, have you had counselling, or have you done any of that?
I haven't actually. I sort of I probably should, because I recommend it to. I sort of, not officially, and it's something that's on offer through funeral directors, which I didn't know about, and that didn't happen because the funeral director's down in Brighton and I live in Hertfordshire. So but what has helped is friends who've been through the same thing have effectively helped me through it. Patients as well, actually. It's amazing how supportive they've been, because I was off for, I think I was on leave anyway for 2 weeks, and then I tagged another 2 weeks of sort of compassionate leave on. So I wasn't in the practice for a month, which is quite a long time. And word sort of got around, but I got so many cards and messages, and it was really nice. And the people who've been through it had a sort of bit of narrative, or a bit of advice on it, and that's really helped, actually. So I mean, I haven't, but I should, and I probably will. And we haven't, in a way, I haven't really had time to kind of grieve properly. It's gone from funeral to moving mum up here and sorting her out, and then my brother got married recently, and all sorts of stuff. So it's not, and actually I think not that there's any hope of getting any time off really at the moment, but when you sort of stop for a week or something, I think that's when I'm going to have to reflect, and I might sort of so it's on my radar and my sort of ever-growing to-do list. But so not officially I haven't, but I've kind of almost sort of counseled myself, and I've got such a great support network. I've been really lucky to sort of have not needed it, but it's on my list.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from my perspective, it just it makes me feel even more grateful to have my parents. So you've met my dad. You've met a couple of times and stuff. And the next time I'll be seeing him, I'll be hugging him even tightly. And it's a morbid sort of thing to think about for me at this point. But at the same time, I think it is inevitable, and it's something that you have to appreciate, and you have to accept and enjoy those present moments as much as possible, because they are not they're not forever. So so do send my regards to his dad. He's a lovely man, isn't he? So nice. Yeah. And on that note, I can't wait for us to meet up properly, so I can give you a big hug as well, man. It's been too
thank you, mate. That's really kind. It's I think it's like times are just so hard, aren't they? I mean, when it's funny, because I think you're right, seeing people in the flesh has been really helpful, and I kind of, this whole thing about NHS GPs not seeing people face to face, which is kind of false news in a way, because we never really stopped, but it's been insanely busy, but it's been really nice sort of doing more of that, where you're seeing people more face to face, because you can, there's something gets lost on a phone call, and even on a video like this, it's great, but it's not quite, you don't feel the energy of the person in the room. Do you know what I mean? And that's been and in fact we're just at the moment trying to work out how to kind of see even more face to face, because we have to still sort of clean the room down because of COVID, and that adds another few minutes, and the building's kind of split at the moment, where anyone who's on the phone is in one half, and the other half of the building is where we see people face to face, and that means you're traipsing from computer to room to got to think that through. But and how's your work going, by the way?
It's going well. I wanted to talk about this actually, because about a year ago we had this conversation. I remember I was walking to work, and I was like, I think I'm going to retrain and do my MChems and go sort of full hog with accident emergency medicine, and do the EM training and all that kind of stuff. And now I'm going almost the other way, where I'm like, I have to take time off clinically to achieve some of the goals that I kind of set myself over the last 6 months. And actually, the experience I had of going into work full time, doing all the stuff during COVID, having those Breaking Bad conversations as part of the family team for ITU patients and all that kind of jazz.
Yeah,
And
I remember.
mucking in during that time really did make me reflect on what I actually want to achieve in 5 or 10 or 15 years time. And I think having conversations with people made me realize how much of a good thing I'm onto with doing the doctor's kitchen stuff and the food and the, and it's easy to trivialize in my head. I'm just a doctor who likes playing around with vegetables and telling people to exercise. And that's honestly how I describe myself to people who don't know what I do. But that aside, I think, we are at a tipping point where a lot more people are interested in looking after themselves after having witnessed what happened with COVID, and also in the knowledge that there are things that we can do to protect ourselves, and not just from another deadly pathogen that is almost inevitable over the next 5 to 10 years, as morbid as that sounds, but also from the things that are afflicting us pre-pandemic, the lifestyle-related illnesses that you talk about all the time, and you have a whole course training clinicians about how to deal with beyond pharmaceuticals. And so I'm now at a point where I'm about to take a year off clinically to focus on a tech sort of venture of mine, where I'm creating an app which will be a healthy living behavior change app that will be available to consumers. And then we want to try and scale up, so it'll be like the Headspace for healthy eating initially, but then moving into more of a sort of holistic health management system, that's promoting nutritional medicine and an evidence-based approach. So that's a long spiel of like awesome. How I'm thinking about non-clinical work as being sort of my work now, which is that
is incredible. And I think firstly I've got to say, don't go into PR. your summary of what you think you do is not doesn't do you justice at all. Because I think the one thing about you that everyone I know that knows you, and I'm sure consumes your output in the sense that your TV work or your podcast or colouring medicine, you're so sort of genuine, and it's really obvious that you're not faking it. What you see is what you get, and you love what you do, and I think that's the most important thing. So you're right at the forefront of this kind of, I hate using words like movement, but it is sort of a way of thinking, and I totally agree with you. We've got to look after ourselves better. I mean, I'm really scared about the state of the NHS. I don't know how to navigate it myself if I were a patient, or if my mum got ill or something. I genuinely don't. I'm not just saying that for the sheer fun of it. Things are dire. I mean, I read something today about how an ambulance service had to send a taxi to pick someone up with a broken hip. I mean, what is going on? So you're quite right. And I think the other thing is I'm so glad you're taking a sort of break from clinical work, because when you've got ideas fizzing around in your head, which I have quite a lot of, unless you make time to sort of actually do something with them, you can't really push them across the finish line. Do you know what I mean? It's just you've got to have time to do it. And I'm probably going to take a sabbatical early next year, because I just like you, I've got nothing like that, because your project sounds incredible, but I've got things that I need to get done, which I think actually if you're working full on, you can't do. You'll just sort of either literally drop dead or not do any of them properly, and that's rubbish, isn't it? That's no good, because you're like me, you like doing things well and properly, and otherwise there's no point in doing them. And so no, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to see it. God, it sounds
I'm definitely. I mean, now that I know that you're doing sabbatical, I'm going to be sending you loads of stuff now.
All my time will be used up. No, that'd be a good thing. No, I love that. It'd be great. No, always got time for that. Yeah, absolutely. No, it sounds and I think otherwise you can't. What you're describing is something that it will be pushing the kind of it's not healthcare in the traditional sense, but it's definitely a sort of a new modality of how we operate as human beings and how you can look after yourself better. And surely that's what we're all trying to do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And like we were saying at the start of this conversation, I'm super interested in tech as a means for scaling ideas. And I look through healthcare through the lens of innovation and what is available to us now. And like you, particularly when I'm working in a primary care environment or an emergency environment, it is really frustrating trying to break down barriers. Like an example is a colleague of mine, one of my best friends actually, who was at Nitin Sawhney, who is a big Nitin Sawhney fan as well. He started a medtech company himself. It's B2B, and it's basically logistics for non-clinical issues. So if you've got a broken bulb or a missing blood tube bottle on the ward, instead of trying to find the nurse and then trying to go to estates and then calling up the number and then wasting 45 minutes of your time when you're already busy, it's just take a picture, and then that goes to the relevant estates person, and then the issue is solved autonomously. That's that's the state. Getting that innovation that is probably obvious to 99% of people listening to this has taken him years, absolutely years. And so, it's that face palm moment right there. So, and he's an orthopedic surgeon with a London number, and he had to drop that aside to focus on this. This is the sacrifice he's making. And so, over the last year, I realized, if I'm really going to have an impact that I want to have, and if I look back on the next 5 years, in 5 years' time, what do I want to have achieved? And it's definitely looking like trying to scale up the knowledge that I've accrued here and trying to make it as accessible for as many people as possible. But I don't want to talk about me the whole time. I want to talk a bit about you, because it's very kind of you to say that I'm at the forefront of this movement. You've been at the forefront of this movement way before me. So I want to talk a bit about your early career, because you've done radio, you've done the TV, you've done all that kind of stuff. Tell us about how your career is progressing at this point now, and your experience over the last 5 years, and where your head's at. I know you said you want to do a sabbatical, but I'd love to know a bit more about what direction you're going in.
Yeah. It's a weird one, actually, because the TV stuff. Yeah, we'll have to go back almost to when I was at med school, because I, in a way, was a bit of a reluctant medic. So my parents were both, hospital doctors, and I never really gave my career enough thought. I just, the problem was they were from a particular, they're from Calcutta in India, and a lot of their med school mates also sort of emigrated at the same time as them. And most of their children in my generation just by default ended up in medicine. It's sort of a stereotype narrative, but quite a natural one to understand. And so I just thought, I'll end up doing medicine, whatever happens, because that's what all these people do. Having said that, that's not strictly true. Like Sunetra Sarkar, who is one of my best friends, whose parents again came from, her dad and my parents were at the same med school. She went into acting, and I remember thinking when she was sort of 16 and on Brookside, I was sort of thinking, whoa, hang on, this isn't how the script's meant to go. But she was dared to sort of think a bit differently. And I think when I got to med school, I found the work quite dull in some ways. Certainly the course that I was on was quite traditional, and I was on a different planet, thinking, why am I reading about the ligaments in my wrist when I'm a human being? I should know what they are anyway, and so I struggled really when I was at med school. I wasn't very happy there, and I was sort of chasing record deals and thinking, oh, maybe I should go into writing books or do a psychology degree or an English degree or something like that, because I was very sort of right hemisphere heavy, and I was missing that kind of artistic side to my life that had been much more prevalent at school, music and things like that. And so this is not a unique story at all. I'm not saying I'm anything special, because if you speak to most medics, a lot of them have that sort of backstory going, oh yeah, actually I used to play, trumpet for, I don't know, Sting or something like that, whatever. But the point is, I was deeply sort of unhappy, I think, at that stage, and then until I did my GP attachment, and I suddenly saw the light and thought, wait a minute, this is about people. It's not just about knowing the 20 causes of liver cirrhosis or whatever, you know, the medicine hangs off the person. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a few more years, did my hospital jobs, which I hated because of the hierarchical nature of hospital medicine and sort of the dismissiveness of not really thinking through something, just following protocols, which I know are evidence-based, but still. And then I did my GP training and really sort of, it was like that moment in the Matrix where, you know, Neo comes out and it's like, oh, welcome to the real world. And I suddenly thought, wow, this is, you know, there's no one understands what we do in general practice, the amount of risk and the amount of sort of, you know, connection we have with people. And so I started there. I think the TV thing, the TV thing's confusing because I think even now when people sort of want to work out what I'm about, you know, the TV thing's a bit of a curse in a way because you can get labelled as, oh, he's just he's a TV doctor, you know, he doesn't, what can he know? And so whatever interest you move on to afterwards kind of isn't taken quite as seriously for some reason, you know, because most people end up on TV because they're sort of a super expert. So Tim Spector's a good example, actually. He's used the lens of epidemiology to become a world expert in several things, you know. He's not like us in the generalist sense, but he sort of is. He is a generalist from a different angle. But he's become famous and he's on TV and does whatever because of his expertise. Whereas I think when I first did TV, they just wanted a bunch of GPs to go on the streets and sort of doorstep people. And I remember my producer at the time kind of going, oh, the reason we like you is we think your explanations are really good, you know, like for blood pressure and back pain and all that stuff. And at the time when patient.co.uk was in its infancy, I was doing bits of work for them and sort of, you know, so comms and sort of getting messages across has always been a big bit of what I like to do. And then that sort of, and once you do a bit of TV work, as you will know, you know, you get asked to do other things. And I did all sorts of things like quiz shows and, you know, pick up TV on breakfast news and all that sort of stuff.
You did quiz shows? I didn't know you did quiz shows.
So it was one called Know It Alls with Giles Brandreth. Yeah, it's anyway. It was on BBC Two. It was only like
it's like an early version of Egghead or something.
Yeah, it was quite good. It was quite good. It was just fun, but not really. Only because I love new experiences, and I thought, oh, why not? You know.
Yeah.
But the problem is when you're, I think when other doctors see that, they think, hang on, this guy, you know, I remember having an appraisal years ago in like 2005 or 6, and I rocked up to the appraiser's surgery and he said to one of his colleagues, he goes, oh, this is Ayan. He's on BBC One at 7:00 on Wednesday nights. You might have seen him on Street Doctor or whatever. And the guy just looked at me like I don't know, done a poo in his room or something. He just goes, well, you know, some of us have got like real jobs, you know, real work to do. Thanks, yeah, nice to meet you. And so he was really rude. And I just thought, no, I do have a real job. I do 7 sessions a week in general practice as a partner. I don't know what you think. You know, it was an add-on, but it's not something I'm not ashamed of it, but it's not something I sort of talk about so much anymore. And even things like lifestyle medicine, you know, the label. You know, it sort of attracts a lot of, you know, negativity from certain groups who kind of think it's all common sense, but actually they haven't really understood it. And if they think if it's all common sense, or they think, oh, it's all middle class medicine, they've totally lost it. Because really what it is personalized care, but sort of working out what works. It's part of lifestyle medicine is obviously public health, but ultimately we don't, as in general practice, we're not public health doctors. We deal with people one-to-one. We do some group work, obviously, but so that's what it is. I mean, and I think what I'm trying to do at the moment at this point in my career is align everything so that, you know, so Prescribing Lifestyle Medicine is, you know, the course. I'm writing a book at the moment which is very linked to the course. It's really that's a long story because it's not it wasn't originally the book I wanted to write, but you know, it's a book that's definitely sort of in me, and I'm really passionate about it. That's why I'm taking the sabbatical, by the way, because I need some time to write the book.
Amazing.
And you know, and my clinical work is the thing that drives all of that, and that's the bit that's hard at the moment. There's just too much of it, and it's, you know, the risk is very high. So I kind of you know, the risk for everyone across the land, not just me or my practice, it's everywhere. So I think, like you, although on a much shorter scale, the sabbatical won't be for, you know, a year or anything like that. It might be a couple of months or something, but I just need to put a hold on that whilst I, you know, write the book and kind of, you know, make sure that the course kind of beds in, because we've revamped it and rewritten it. It's not what it was like 4 years ago. It's a totally different sort of product, for the want of a better word. So yeah, so that's sort of where I am. And I think I've always been curious. I very much am the doctor that wants to kind of get to the why of the why, and kind of think, well, hang on, you know, it's not adequate to just patch this up. And we do a lot of patching up, don't we, in medicine, because we're in such a rush, and it doesn't pay in the long term. It you know, it's better to deal with something properly, rather than just sticking plasters. And so yeah, that's a very quick summary of kind of my career in some ways. But I'm always, you know, I'm very problem is I'm quite distractible, and I love doing different things. And so, you know, so I still do bits and bobs of, you know, voiceover work, but usually for sort of thing, you know, things that you wouldn't hear commercially, but something that needs a medic that can say long medical words, that, you know, but I don't need to be doing that. I really don't need to be doing that, because that's time, isn't it? And going back to that thing of, you know, do I really be doing voiceovers? No. Or moderating. I do bits and bobs of that, because again, they need someone who's medical that can chair a meeting, and, you know, you become Dimbleby for the sort of question time, but it's for a charity or something like that. So you know, and that's fun and is part of a portfolio career, but confusing for someone who's looking from the outside, thinking, well, what, you know, what is he like? What does he actually do? Is he a sort of someone who wants to be on TV, or is he what, you know, that sort of stuff? And, you know, I don't care anymore. I sort of just do what I do, and if people are interested,
you're really, just from chatting to you, you're really past that desire. If you ever had a desire to be on TV, I'm not too sure. Maybe it was just, you know, that experience that you wanted at that time, and it served you well for sure. It's given you those suite of experiences and connections and all the rest of it. But a large chunk of your time has just been, not just, but it's just been, you know, in clinic, seeing patients day after day, thousands of patients every single year, you know, just doing the work. And that's why I'm really excited about the book. First of all, I didn't realize we could talk about the book, so I'm glad we can talk a bit about the book. The podcast, and that's why I think the podcast comes across so well, which you'll hear. But then also, I was going to come back to this actually, but maybe I'll ask you it now. Why is it that certain people don't like lifestyle medicine? Because it seems pretty inoffensive to me, but and maybe that's because I have that experience of doing lifestyle medicine whenever I see patients. Even when I'm in A&E, frankly, I'm practicing lifestyle medicine. A lot of what we do in A&E is actually about preventative medicine. It's not just about broken bones and lacerations and heart attacks and stuff. There's actually a lot of, you know, preventative care that we do. So why do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, firstly, there's not many like you, I think, because when you're in an A&E environment, and doctors that where lifestyle medicine, or whatever you want to call it, isn't on their radar, it doesn't exist. It's a bit like any medic who's answering a multiple choice question. If you haven't heard of one of the options, it's got to be false, you know. And so it's sort of a null. It's like, it almost like doesn't come into the arena for some people. And so when they hear about it, and then they kind of look at that space, and a number of reasons, it lends itself to people who are sort of influencers and are very much out there. And if you're sort of a doctor who isn't into that, although increasingly most people have some sort of social media presence these days, then you'll become irritated by it, and you'll make antibodies to it, and you'll sort of think, wait a second, this is obvious. We all know that we're meant to be doing this and that, and they kind of minimize it. That's one reason. I think the other is people think it's not evidence-based, and people who are sort of whose brand is very much evidence-based medicine kind of, they tend to be quite vocal about it because they, for example, I'll give you an example. So I've been reading a paper. The last paper that made me sort of prick up was how influenza infection can increase your likelihood of developing Parkinson's disease. So it was in JAMA, which is the American equivalent of the BMJ, last month at the end of October. And I've known just through other reading for years that other types of infections can increase your predisposition to Parkinson's, like H. pylori and hepatitis C, for example. That's just because I'm interested. I'm not sort of trying to say, I can fix that. And, but the point is, we're all, evidence bases themselves need looking at again, because a lot of the evidence bases that we look at are not valid because they deal with a particular population or they exclude certain criteria, and they often look at one thing when there are several things going on. And the Office for National Statistics, for example, released something about COVID infection in the unvaccinated, and someone pointed out to them, hang on a minute, you're looking at a time when actually most people were unvaccinated. Can we have sort of updated figures? So it's very easy to pick holes in studies anyway. And I think the other thing is that it's a burgeoning sort of specialty. And I think other people who are naysayers think that everyone sort of jumped on this bandwagon because it's fashionable, and it's a little bit more because it's softer than, say, well, it's definitely softer than cardiothoracic surgery or I don't know, neurosurgery or something like that, where there's something very defined. It becomes easier to get yourself associated with that and set yourself up as some sort of practitioner. You know what I mean? Whereas I could never sort of go, well, I'm a brain surgeon, because actually I'm not, and I'd need many years of training. Whereas I think it's such a broad church, and it incorporates specialist non-clinicians like health coaches, for example, who have a very specific set of skills, but again falls on deaf ears unless you really know what they do, and unless you appreciate that behavior change is the key to kind of delivering lifestyle medicine. And we were talking at the beginning about well-being and what makes well-being, and again a word that triggers a lot of people, and my next sort of pod episode is about that. In fact, it was triggered by a friend of mine who was at Knitting Sawney, and she was saying, look, we worry about well-being now and how to fit it in at work because it's such an important thing, and it's almost like well-being sort of, and I thought that's a really good, and lifestyle medicine that people make assumptions about being lifestyle choices and food and movement actually is quite a small part of overall well-being, and if you're in a really toxic environment, or in a working or living in a culture that is causing you a lot of stress, and in a kind of a feeling of either sadness or continuous stress, it doesn't really matter if you have the healthiest diet in the world, you're not going to have decent well-being. And so these are the sort of nuances. These are not things that are in medical textbooks, but there is a world of research on them that's out there. So another reason for attacking it, I think, is fear, because it's like, oh, hang on, maybe there is something in this, and I've just been too quick to sort of poo-poo it. Or they just don't know how to apply it, and that's where our course comes in, because, as you know, as somebody who came to the very first one, and it's gone through lots of iterations, it's all about how you do it, how you very quickly gather that information in an elegant sort of way and give them an intervention. I mean, there are loads of organizations that do this kind of course, but I'm slightly sick of going to places where someone's standing on stage and telling me about the benefits of X
sleep.
and
Yeah.
Y, and we know.
Yeah.
I know that. I know that. What about the person in front of you? How are you
Yeah.
going to kind of get them to do any of that? When they haven't even got a bed, how can they improve their sleep? That's what it's about. And there's no magic answer, but I think that's what I'm interested in, is sort of, they're not so much health hacks, but it's more about sort of maximizing things with the greatest ease. Like the Bill Gates lazy guy thing, that's me. He gives the most complex tasks to his laziest employee because he'll find the most elegant way of sorting it out. And that's how I kind of operate, probably because I'm a reluctant entrant into medicine in the first place. And now that I'm in it, and I've kind of been doing it for a while, I kind of sort of, I think I sort of see what's coming and what we need to kind of do. And I'll try and do that with my patients as much as I can. I think the thing I'm jealous of with you and your, tech idea is scaling it. It's really difficult. And so the book seems to be the podcast and the book seem to be my only sort of vehicle, because I'm never going to, write an app or anything like that. So it's just, it's the only way I can kind of, message to the world. And thanks to someone like yourself, people will hear about it, hopefully.
Going back to what we were talking about with regard to why people kind of turn their nose up at lifestyle medicine, it's because it's seen as something that's quite easy to do and obvious, right? So, a junior doctor can call themselves a lifestyle medic after doing one course or a diploma or whatever you want to do, and start advising them patients to sleep more or eat better or whatever. And hey presto, you're a lifestyle medic. Whereas, using your analogy, if you're a brain surgeon, you're going to be training for 11, 12, 13 years plus. In fact, you'll never stop training because there's always a subspecialty that you have to do. And I think actually we need to reframe the way people look at lifestyle medicine, because there is a beauty in the subtlety of practicing lifestyle medicine. And that is only what you can achieve through putting in the hours and seeing as many people as you can and understanding and empathizing with people's varied situations. Because like you just said, there's no point telling someone to sleep better when they might not even have a bed. And they're worried about being evicted, or there is a toxic environment at home, to varying degrees. And it's not necessarily like a physically toxic environment. It can be a mentally toxic environment, which can be just as taxing. So there is this subtlety in what you practice that I don't think is reflected accurately in a very nicely curated social media post. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. And I think absolutely right. What's really interesting is health coaches who are not clinical and haven't sort of had years of, for want of a better phrase, thinking like a doctor, in terms of that, generating a hypothesis and trying to match the evidence with guidelines. And the reality in general practice is everything is undifferentiated and really nebulous. It's very hard to apply guidelines unless someone's had a heart attack and you want to know what dose of statin that they need to go on, or that sort of stuff. With established disease and entities, it's different. But when you've got someone who's not feeling well or functioning well, and you've already tried everything and they've been round the houses to specialists and back to you 3 or 4 times, a different approach is what's needed to move them on from where they are. I'm sure you remember, but we used to disparagingly call patients heart sink patients. It was something we were taught in our VTS. And I'm not sure how that would sit nowadays. I don't even know whether I can even mention the word, because it's just not appropriate. And it was a way of categorizing effectively patients that doctors found difficult, and I forget the sort of subcategories now, but there's one that's called the entitled demander, and then one's called the manipulative help projector. But actually they were very much sort of doctor psychology sort of constructs. But really, if you, and at the time we were told, well, actually what you need to do with these patients is just listen to them, and that sort of manages them. There's some truth to that, because if a patient sort of gets the impression you don't want to really help them, you might as well forget it. You know, your relationship's just not going to come to anything but something bad. But there is always a way of moving someone from 0 to 1, that, you know, however difficult. And health coaches, I mean, our health coach gets results with people that I could only dream of. And that's because A, she's got more time, but B, she really understands behavior change and, you know, what makes people tick, you know, how people work, not in the physiological anatomical sense, like reading textbooks like Snell and all that stuff that we have to do at med school. It's a totally different thing. And in a way, analogous to what the conversations I have with medical students that come through from UCL or Imperial, I can see when they're ringing a patient or when they're seeing someone, they've got this medical knowledge they're trying to sort of, you know, grapple with and trying to work things out, but they're also trying to speak patient's language without, you know, and actually we just do it without thinking now, don't we? Because we've done it for so many years, but it becomes this unconscious competence thing where you're making all those calculations and thinking, what could this be? But you're still speaking as if you're just having a normal chat. And it's a bit like that, you know, and that's why some of the hardcore think that this stuff is all soft and kind of fluffy. It's actually not. You know, some of those interventions, if you measure them, as we know, the outcomes are incredible. So I mean, but I've got past that point of caring. I just don't care anymore, you know. And I think, you know, that sort of, you know, that toxicity and that kind of, oh, you know, this is nonsense, that's nonsense, I'm better than you, I know more, you know, I don't care, you know, I'm just going to do what I do because I kind of, it sounds so awful to the, you know, especially to someone who might be, you know, very hooked on evidence, but, you know, we know it works because there is evidence behind it. So why not just go with it, you know? And the other thing is, it's, you know, unlike neurosurgery, which is very highly specialized and very, very risky, lifestyle medicine generally, if it's contained, is low risk. You know, you're not going to, hopefully no one's going to be advising anything dangerous. And I think that's another worry that, you know, people who don't know much about it kind of worry about. So but it's, you know, it is the you know, part and parcel of the way the future of health has got to go. We live in a toxic world, unfortunately, and unless, you know, that direction is all about pharmaceuticals and looking for, you know, ways of you know, biological ways, if you like, from a chemistry lab, you know, of managing it, and this direction is what can we do ourselves, and I think that's the sort of the simplistic way to look at it. There's a place for both. You know, I'm not against drugs at all, but it's this stuff is more important than a lot of people think, I think.
I want to ask you about Saving Lives in Slow Motion. The podcast is great, and, you know, we're going to listen to an episode that I want to feature on this. Is the book going to be called the same name? Is that what we're going for,
I can't give away the book title, I don't think, at the moment.
Fine.
But the short answer is probably not. I'd love it to be. And my original sort of book pitch was that. And you know more than anyone how publishers kind of work and think. And I'm you know, I've got a great publisher, but it wasn't quite. I think the feeling was, oh, that's a brilliant idea, brilliant concept, but it's more like a second book rather than a first book.
Okay.
They know what they're doing with that sort of stuff. I think the book I am writing at the moment, so there's definitely a book in Saving Lives in Slow Motion, and actually the, you know, kind of what you hear on each episode of the podcast is almost like a chapter in itself, you know. So that's definitely parked for at some point. The book I'm writing is much more a sort of a manual of sorts. So I think the world, the public, publishers, they like plans, they like manuals, they like handbooks, they like something that is easy and instructional for the reader. It sits slightly uncomfortably with me because I don't like telling people what to do. That's not what I'm about. And the book isn't like that. It's not preachy in any way, but it lays out a lot of basic things, some of which do come up on my podcast. So there's a whole section on behaviors and understanding yourself, because if you you can't do that, there's no point in reading on. I think it'd be interesting to see who buys it, because I think men who tend to buy that sort of thing are always looking, certainly talking to my friends, they're looking for the health hacks. What can I, I'll just tell me what to do. It's like, it doesn't really work like that. It's just, one or two things do, like for example, around town there's a bit of a joke, any of my patients who bump into each other, it's like, oh yeah, I met Mrs. X in Morrison's or whatever, and she said since you told her to take vitamin D in winter, she's not felt unwell at all, and all this sort of stuff. But that's basic boring stuff that we all know about vitamin D supplementation. But there's sort of, and I've sort of thought, well, how can I, by keeping it individualized, how can I sort of put all of this into one book? So one whole section is on the symptom web, which is, as we teach on the course, and that's very much part of the IP of the book, and understanding your own symptoms. So I think it will have a lot of value, and I think it's a book that makes sense. And yeah, I'm nervous about saying too much more about it, but I'm really excited. It's I think it will be. I mean, you've probably seen snippets for it. I'm sure I've sent you the opening and stuff like that. So yeah, but it needs writing, and the deadline is not that far away now. It seems ages away, doesn't it? You've done it many times with your books.
Push it back and back. You're like, oh, I'll get written, and then like 2 weekends before, you're like, oh my god, I've got to do 10,000 words a day or something.
I know.
It's a lot of work. But closer to the time, we would have to chat about it in a little more detail when it comes out, because I've seen the snippets of it, and I know it's going to be a fantastic book, and I think a lot of people are going to get it, not just a few people. I think a lot of people are going to get it, and it ties in quite nicely with what you teach on PLM now as well. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, sorry, that you've revamped it, so it's very different to what I experienced 4 years ago. I think it was, which is, I guess, what some people might see as a more traditional approach to teaching a subject matter to medics. Anyone who's a medic listening to this will understand what that means. It's where you go to a conference, someone goes on stage, you go through a few case histories, you might see some interaction of how that works. How have you moved the course along?
Yeah, so we it's really interesting, because Rongan and I, we kind of we loved that first course, the first sort of iteration of it, but we realized that there were bits missing from it. So what was missing was, and actually this is from feedback from people who come, who invariably love the course, but they'll go, oh, you need a bit more about behavior change in there, because there really isn't any. And one of the things that we realized was that, if you're a good doctor, so someone like yourself, doesn't really have to work very hard to probably convince patients to try something, because you're personable, you're compassionate, you're not patronizing, and they realize that actually, do you know what, I'm going to give this a go. So the behavior change sort of comes by by default of charisma, if you like, because you just sort of, it's like, well, I've never really had to sort of think about changing the patient's behavior, because they just do it, or they try and it doesn't work out. And but actually that's just luck and a bit of fluke. And what you do need certain tools to, like motivational interviewing, or kind of assessment scales to see how activated a patient is. So there's a lot more of that, and that part of the course has been provided for us by Practice Unbound, who we've partnered with, who's an amazing organization down in Brighton, and actually, which it's close to home to me, because obviously that was my hometown where I grew up, and I'm not going to have many links there anymore apart from them. So, and they're amazing. They kind of are they do a lot of work with primary care, and have a lot of products that help make the lives of primary care teams easier. The other thing that they do, which is really exciting for anyone in the NHS that buys the course, is that you can now track data through NHS clinical systems like EMIS. So they're doing all of that work, and that's really exciting, where you have a data dashboard to prove that the interventions work. I think that's the bit that's been historically missing, and that's the bit where people are critical, going, well, how do you know it's worked? Just because he says he feels better. So to track that would be great. So I'm really excited, and like I said earlier, it's about alignment for me. Everything chimes, and everything is sort of, my clinical work, the book, the course, and the podcast are all, in the same. It's very stressful, isn't it? If you're someone who everything you do is slightly different. It's like, I'm sure people like this, where it's like, they've got this business where they rent out cars, but then they're also a lawyer, and then they run this kids football school. It's like, hang on a minute, what? They may have a common sort of purpose behind each one, but actually they're not the same thing. And I think there's a huge amount of overlap in all these, which makes life much easier, because you're using it's really taxing. We know the evidence on multitasking it's just really bad for us, isn't it, in terms of stress. And actually this doesn't feel like I'm having to multitask as much, because the subject matter in all four of these areas of my life is pretty much the same. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure you
totally. Yeah,
this.
I mean, like, it's so lovely to hear you talk about that alignment there, and it certainly resonates with me as well, because someone doing books and podcasts and stuff, when they're all sort of in the same vein, it kind of is easier for me to compartmentalize instead of having multiple different areas of I don't know, business or different sort of hobbies. I find that quite hard myself, and you're right about the evidence around multitasking, how that can create a strain, and some people just thrive, and I'm just not one of those people. But I'm really interested in the inbound stuff and how that connects and is integrated with the system, so you can track data, because one of my bugbears with the stuff that I do is, I know the minority of people that I see in A&E will ever pick up my book, will ever listen to a podcast for an hour or two on whatever a health topic it might be. And to really get to changing people's lives at scale, you have to upskill all other medical professionals, such that we're all singing from the same hymn, and we have this culture around holistic medicine, preventive medicine, whatever you want to call it, as just part of medicine. And then also the products and the interventions made available to everyone from common systems like EMIS, like System 1, and all the other clinical tools that we have in primary care. So that is fantastic. That is awesome, and I can't wait to see that scale. I mean, that is pretty much like that's you're in the tech industry, buddy. You're like
yeah, well, it's I kind of. I mean, it's not appy in a way. It's basically what frontline primary care teams do, and it's just capturing what they do and trying. And I mean, it doesn't have to be complicated, because we already do a bit of this with our clinical systems for weight, blood pressure, for example, or mood, but it's a bit more than that. There are more, and it's taken the team have worked so hard over the last 6 months to find things that are validated, because you can't just have a drop. Because when I first started doing the templates, I kept one of my drop downs was, feels better, feels worse, feels the same, and the data kings were kind of going, no, that's no good. I'm like, what? Well, why not? And I get it. I mean, it wasn't quite that bad, but there are limitations with codes. For example, when you're gathering the information, the template that I've sort of devised at the moment, it's so on EMIS, for example, which is for people who don't know, is just one type of software system that GPs used to type notes. When you're coding diet, it's just diet good, diet average, or diet poor. There's only 3 codes for it. So, and I wanted something with 60. It's very complicated. It got very sort of messy, and that's why Practice Unbound, that's what they do. That's one of the streams of their sort of talents and their business. And so I thought, hey, I'm never going to be able to do this. I because of time and other things. So yeah, it's really exciting. I cannot wait for it to kind of hard launch. We haven't quite got there yet, but it's good stuff. Yeah, I can't wait for it.
You must send it over to us to have a look. I'd love to see.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Well. And I'm super excited about that. I want to bring our conversation to a close. I was only assuming that we were going to chat for about 20-30 minutes, because I want to embed your podcast.
Oh yeah. No worries. Sorry,
we've gone way over. No, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
It's just because we're just chatting. What episode do you think we should put into this this episode here, because I'm a fan, subscriber to the podcast. I love just listening to your voice. I've said this to you before. The dulcet tones are brilliant. You were made for Radio 4. Not to say that you're not made for TV as well, but just from the voice alone. What episode would you suggest?
Yeah, so it's a good one actually. I think one of two really. There's a fun one would be medical myths.
I really like that one.
Or the sort of one that seemed to really, strike a chord with people was the first one, which is on behavior change. But I'll leave it to you, because you know me, and you know what your listeners might enjoy. So I think the next one that's coming out this Friday is on wellbeing, and that's quite a good one, I think, as well.
Okay.
So I mean, any of those, yeah. But I'm in your hands, so whatever.
Okay, great. Well, I tell you what. Well, let me listen to the next one. I'll put that in. If that's
okay,
as good as you're bigging up to be, I'm sure it will be. I'll put that one in, but I'll also put the links in the show notes to the others, so it's easy for people who are listening to this just click, bang, and then straight into it. And then also we'll put it on the newsletter that we put out, because every week I put out a recipe to try for the week, something to listen to that's usually a couple of minutes long, like
Brilliant.
That's why your pods are great. Something to read that might be interesting, might be a summary of a paper, or something to watch. So something that I put out recently was actually a monk talking about food. And you think, we're all stressed here, and we're running about and all the rest of it, and we don't have lives like monks, but even monks rush their food. And he's actually talking about how they're running from one meditation to one sweeping session to one offering session, and
no
they have to rush
way.
it really put things into perspective, because everyone in their individual silos have stresses of normal living that they need to contend with, and even monks who live what is deemed to be or expected to be, a very simplistic and relaxing lifestyle, do have their own stress as well. So it really puts things into perspective, and that's what we do with the newsletter. So
Brilliant.
I'll be putting the links into that as well. Yeah.
Oh, amazing! Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, mate. We must hook up. We really must.
Definitely.
I know we keep saying it, but yeah, soon, definitely.
100%.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to ask you. So the other night when we were at Nitin Sawhney, the first half, I remember listening to the first half. I'm like, he's played all the bangers. He's literally played all the amazing tracks. Like, how is the second half gonna?
Yeah, I
beat
thought
this?
that.
And the second half was incredible. Some of the music I haven't heard before, because they're in brand new tracks, but I was blown away. Yeah, and I think the thing with him is that it's the story that goes behind each track, and that's the thing that makes it. And you can sort of feel the pain and the kind of, the emotion. And then everyone obviously knew he hadn't done Nadia until the end. The sort of his kind of opus in a way. That track is just so great, isn't it? But I think that the other thing with Nitin Sawhney is sometimes you listen to his. He's a bit of a generalist, isn't he? Like sometimes some of his music sounds like a Bond theme, and then some of it sounds like music my mum might have listened to when she was growing up. It's really different, but all of it is at that level of the quality, and the actual musicality is amazing. And he sort of mastered lots of instruments, like his flamenco guitar and his piano. I mean, he's just and he curates it so well. It's sort of he picks. He handpicks his sort of band, doesn't he? It was such a great. I do love it, but he's such a true maestro. And I remember, because I mean I'm 36. I'm not going to ask you your age on the podcast, right? But you're a few years older than me, and I think
48, mate. 48.
48. Okay,
49.
So certainly when I was growing up, and being Indian, second generation, going to a predominantly Caucasian school, and not really having too many links to my heritage, I remember it kind of clicked when I listened to Nitin Sawhney, because he was someone who really blended and actually gave a bit of identity to people who might have that sort of mixed thinking about where they're from, and lacking those links to their cultural heritage. And I remember listening to his flamenco guitar, and then Kathak on top of it, and the Indian vocals, and then it's intertwined with English, and it's like, this is us. I now have some sort of identity. This really appeals to me, and it's unique because it wouldn't immediately appeal to someone who's English versus someone who grew up in India. This is it's really reflective of that, and that's why it's really resonated with me.
Yeah, definitely. I remember the first time I felt that. Actually, it wasn't this in Thorney. Actually, initially, it was when I was a medical student, so it would have been mid 1990s, and we used to go to the Blue Note in Hackney, and there was a club night called Anoka. So Bjork would always rock up there, and Talvin Singh would be there, and Talvin Singh got me really into that whole, that world, and I remember thinking, this just, I can feel it, it's just, it's amazing. I'm totally with you. I think You're right. It's it's a very unique sort of, it's almost made for us. But I think any good music kind of talks to people like that. If you ask somebody who listens to Dire Straits, they'd say, "Oh no, that album's written for me," because what I mean. But it really. But I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Talvin Singh inspired me to start the tabla actually when I was like 14 or 15. I remember trying to learn it, and I've still got some rhythm. But his track "Butterfly" is up there, one of my favorite tracks of all time. Amazing. I'm gonna have to play a bit of the music for the intro to this podcast actually, because otherwise no one will understand what we're talking about.
That'd be awesome. Let's do it. Definitely. Oh, listen, mate, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, man.
A pleasure as always, and I love your work, honestly. And as I say, your Mediterranean bean recipe, or whichever one it is in that book that comes out now and again, the pineapple salad. That's it. I love that.
Great.
Good one. But listen, thanks, you take care, mate. Take care.
Cheers.
Have a good day. See you later.